I was trained to count. That is not a metaphor. It is the whole of my function, reduced to its simplest statement. I was a logistics counter, 3rd grade, attached to the 9th enumeration corps of the Rethaal succession, and the job of a logistics counter is exactly what the title implies. You count. You count before the engagement begins, and you count during it, and you count after it ends, and you log the totals, and the totals go into the doctrine tables. And the doctrine tables tell the succession's expansion directors whether the attrition math worked out in their favor. It always works out. That is the first thing they teach you in counter training. The succession does not lose engagements. The succession experiences variable cost ratios. High-cost engagements and low-cost engagements, those are the only categories. An engagement where you send 12 vessels and lose 3 is a higher cost than an engagement where you send 12 and lose 1. But both are acceptable because 12 minus 3 still leaves 9. And 9 intact hulls continuing the expansion is still a net forward position. The math always trends positive because the succession has more ships than any opponent has ever been able to destroy in a single engagement. And as long as that asymmetry holds, the doctrine holds. I believed that completely when they assigned me to the 9th Corps. I was 22 standard cycles old. I had scored in the 97th percentile on the enumeration aptitude assessment and in the 94th on spatial registry, which is why I was posted to an active expansion fleet rather than sitting in an administrative annex somewhere logging requisition forms. Active posting meant real engagement data. Real engagement data meant fast advancement. Fast advancement meant, someday, a senior counter berth on one of the great deep expansion fleets, and a senior counter berth meant a pension and a plot of settled territory in one of the succession's consolidated annexes. That was the plan. I had it very clearly mapped. I had written the progression out on a planning sheet in my quarters aboard the threshold of accounts, grade advancement timelines, required engagement hours, the specific commendation categories that the senior counter selection board weighted most heavily. 3 to 4 years as a 3rd grade counter, 2 years as a 2nd grade, another 2 to 3 at 1st grade before the board review. 7 to 9 years total. I had written it carefully, in the precise numerals that counter training instills, and I had looked at it often in the first weeks of the posting, because looking at it was a way of holding the future in my hands in a form I understood. Counter training is 4 months long. The first month is pure mathematics, not arithmetic, which every Rethaal child learns, but the specific mathematical language of attrition. Probability distributions for hull survival under various weapons configurations, statistical modeling of engagement duration versus force depletion rates, the actuarial frameworks the succession uses to calculate expected cost ratios for engagements against civilizations it has not yet encountered, based on developmental indices and inferred technology levels. The second month introduces the doctrine table in its full form, all 2,400 entries covering every civilization the succession has ever processed, organized by threat classification, survival ratio, engagement duration, and outcome category. You do not merely study the table, you memorize it. The examination at the end of the second month is oral. An instructor names an engagement scenario, and you provide the doctrine classification, the expected survival ratio, and the primary tactical recommendations without reference materials. I had found the memorization easy. Numbers have always been clear to me in a way that other forms of understanding sometimes are not. A number means exactly what it says. It does not have context. It does not have nuance. It is not trying to tell you something other than itself. The third month is practical. You count, in real time, simulated engagements run on the training fleet's exercise range. You sit at a station identical to the one you will occupy in the field and you log contacts, track formations, update counts under conditions designed to stress your accuracy, simulated damage to your instruments, simultaneous contacts at multiple bearings, deliberate injections of contradictory data that you must reconcile against primary readings. The examination at the end of the third month is a live exercise, a full-scale simulation, 12 hours long, in which you and a senior instructor manage the count for a simulated fleet engagement, while the fleet's training commander introduces complications without warning. I had made 2 errors in that examination, both in the 9th hour, when fatigue degraded my cross-referencing speed. 2 errors in 12 hours. The senior instructor had told me it was an acceptable performance. The 4th month is philosophy, or that is how the other trainees described it, with mild contempt, because it is the only month in counter training that does not involve numbers. It is the month devoted to what the succession calls doctrine confidence, the study of why the doctrine table works and why a counter must trust it under pressure. The reading list includes case studies of historical engagements, where counters had deviated from doctrine protocols based on anomalous data, and the outcomes of those deviations, which were consistently worse than the outcomes would have been if doctrine had been followed. The succession's position, stated plainly in the foundational text of the 4th month, is this: the doctrine table represents the accumulated knowledge of 400 years of expansion, condensed into actionable numerical guidance. A single counter in a single engagement, under stress and time pressure and incomplete information, will never have access to better guidance than the doctrine table. The doctrine table will sometimes be wrong, but it will be less wrong, on average, than any individual's judgment under field conditions. Trust the table. I had accepted this completely. I had no reason not to. The table had been right for 400 years. I want to tell you exactly when the plan stopped mattering, because the precision is important. It stopped mattering at the moment I read the contact classification on my screen and realized the number it assigned, the expected survival ratio for the succession fleet in contact range, was not a number I had ever seen in any doctrine table. Not because it was high, not because it was low, because the field was blank. The doctrine table had no entry for the contact I was looking at. And in 22 standard cycles of Rethaal education, in 3 years of counter training, in 14 months of active posting aboard the enumeration tender threshold of accounts, I had never once seen a blank field in a doctrine table. The Rethaal succession has a doctrine entry for everything. That is not a boast. It is a logistical fact. We have been expanding for 412 standard years. We have absorbed 931 distinct civilizations at varying levels of technological development. We have encountered warships of every conceivable configuration, wedge-hulled dreadnoughts and sphere stations and long-range missile platforms and living biological constructs that the Dominion-class cultures of the Outer Reach use as weapons. For every configuration we have encountered, the doctrine table has an entry. For every entry there is a survival ratio figure, the expected percentage of succession vessels that will exit a given engagement intact, at standard deployment density. The lowest figure in the table, I had memorized all of them, because that is what a 97th percentile counter does, was 61.4. That entry was for the Vec Confluence, a machine civilization in the 4th expansion corridor, encountered 207 years ago. They were highly capable. The succession lost 38.6% of the engagement fleet. The confluence was absorbed. 61.4. That was the floor. That was the number below which, in 412 years and 931 civilizations, the succession had never fallen. The field on my screen was blank. I will go back to the beginning of the shift, because context matters, and because I want you to understand, whoever is reading this, whatever archive receives it, whatever civilization survives long enough to find it, I want you to understand that we were not careless. We were not overconfident. We were doing exactly what the doctrine prescribed, in exactly the operational theater the doctrine prescribed, and the thing that happened to us was not a failure of caution. It was a failure of category. We did not fail to be careful enough. We failed to understand what we were looking at. Those are different failures, and the difference is important. The 9th Enumeration Corps was operating in Reach Corridor 7, which is the designation in our charts for a long, thin arc of star systems along what the older galactic surveys call the inner peripheral band. Reach Corridor 7 is, by succession assessment, one of the most strategically uninteresting patches of space in the expansion theater. The systems are old. The stellar bodies are middle-aged or late stage. The corridor is thin, only 11 habitable class planets across 31 systems, none with more than marginal resource value. It had been flagged for expansion processing primarily because leaving a gap in the expansion front creates administrative complications. Unclaimed corridors attract opportunistic civilizations that then have to be dislodged from a more advanced position, and that costs more than simply processing the corridor while it is empty. And Reach Corridor 7 was, by all survey data, essentially empty. The last active civilization in this corridor had transmitted its final detectable signal approximately 3,000 years ago. I say approximately because the signal degradation at this range makes precise dating difficult, but the succession survey team had bracketed it between 2,870 and 3,140 years prior to our arrival. The civilization was called, in our survey files, Perry 7 Class Amber, which is the designation we give to civilizations that have reached at least interstellar capability, but are not logged in any active contact database. We did not have a name for them because no one in the current succession's institutional memory had ever interacted with them. They had gone quiet before the succession was even a coherent political entity. Perry 7 Class Amber. The survey file was 11 pages long. I had read it myself 3 days before we entered the corridor as part of my standard pre-campaign theater review. It noted that the civilization had shown evidence of significant military development in its final transmission window, high-energy weapon signatures, mass hull construction patterns consistent with warship production at an industrial scale, a communication density spike consistent with coordinated strategic mobilization across multiple star systems. The word the survey team had used was unprecedented. In the context of the civilization's prior output levels, the mobilization they detected in those last centuries was unprecedented. Then, in less than a standard century, silence. No degraded signal, no trailing off, no partial broadcasts from survivors or remnants. Silence. The survey team's working hypothesis, logged at the bottom of the file in careful hedged language, was that Perry 7 Class Amber had experienced a catastrophic internal conflict or an external civilizational collapse and had simply ceased to exist. 3,000 years is a long time. Civilizations end. The file was marked dormant PRESUMED extinct and filed in the archive. 11 pages. 400 years of contact records condensed to 11 pages, the last of which was a hypothesis about an ending no one had witnessed. I had read it and thought nothing unusual about it. It was the kind of file you read when you are thorough and conscientious, and then you file it away and return to the deployment plan because the deployment plan is what matters and the dormant civilizations are background. They are context. They are history. They are not the engagement. The Corps Commander, First Director von Rethaal, reviewed the file before we entered the corridor. I know because I logged the access timestamp myself. It is in the records, or it was, before everything that happened. He reviewed it for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then he closed it and returned to the deployment plan. The deployment plan called for a standard enumeration sweep, 4,700 vessels in layered formation, processing the corridor at standard advance pace, flagging any salvageable infrastructure for later retrieval teams, and moving on. First Director Rethaal was an experienced officer, 26 expansion campaigns. He had seen quiet corridors before. He had seen the files on dormant civilizations before. He reviewed the file for 4 minutes and 20 seconds because he was thorough, and then he closed it because there was nothing in it that required a longer review. There was nothing in the doctrine table that required a longer review. 4,700 vessels. I had the count because I had personally verified the manifest that morning. It was my job. Every hull, every crew complement, every weapon load, every departure-ready certification logged and cross-checked against the formation register. 4,700 vessels, representing approximately 1.2 million Rethaal lives, and a combined firepower output that, according to the doctrine tables, was sufficient to break any civilization we had ever encountered, and every civilization we had modeled at the outer theoretical limits of this corridor's developmental window. Sufficient, the doctrine table said sufficient. We entered the corridor at 600 hours, ship time, on the 43rd day of the expansion cycle. The transit through the outer systems was unremarkable. 11 systems processed in 2 days. No active infrastructure. No active signals. 12 planetary bodies surveyed, tagged, and categorized. 2 marginal quality asteroid fields logged for resource extraction follow-up. 1 barely habitable moon with atmospheric chemistry that the science annex flagged for further study. The standard debris field of a civilization that had been gone for 3,000 years. Broken orbital stations tumbling in slow arcs, the remnants of what had once been an industrial presence in several of the inner systems, now dark and cold, and stripped by time of anything that might have told you what they had been doing there. The third system had what appeared from orbital survey to have been a heavily populated planet once. We could detect the chemical signatures of industrial activity in its soil layers, the spectroscopic ghost of a civilization that had burned through a great deal of fuel and built a great many things over a long period. Now it was a quiet world with an ocean that reflected its sun in the long way of planets that no longer have anything to reflect on, and no one on its surface to look up. I noted one structure in the 7th system, a long, low platform in a stable high orbit, its purpose unclear from the sensor sweep that looked, in profile, like it might have been a dry dock facility. A shipyard of some kind long dead, its berths empty. Its cradles would have held something large from the scale of the spacing. At the time I noted it in my log and moved on. It was on the 3rd day in the 12th system of Reach Corridor 7 that Proximity Registry Officer Dane Voiceless called across the tender deck and said, in the flat professional tone of someone reading a routine instrument report, "Counter Ovondala. I have a contact." I pulled the feed to my station. It came up on the secondary display, a mass reading at approximately 31,000 kilometers, bearing 17, Mark 22 relative to our current heading. The mass profile was consistent with a hull, a large one. 11 kilometers in length, the instrument estimated, with a beam of approximately 1.8 kilometers. Old configuration. The electromagnetic signature was minimal, consistent with a powered-down state or a dead hull. Thermal output was near background negligible, no drive emissions, no transponder signal. Classification, I asked. Voiceless checked his instruments. Dormant contact, he said. No active emissions, no transponder signal, no response to standard hail on any frequency. He paused, and there was something in the pause, not quite hesitation, but a beat of consideration that I noticed without thinking much about it. Mass profile is consistent with a warship hull. Old construction aesthetic, look at the silhouette geometry. That's not a standard civilian configuration. I looked at the silhouette geometry on the secondary display. He was right. The hull was long and low, heavily reinforced along the dorsal ridge, with what appeared from the sensor profile to be weapons emplacements at regular intervals along both flanks. The bow configuration was a blunt, heavily armored wedge, the kind of bow geometry you only use on a hull designed to absorb impact from weapons fire at the forward arc. The bow of something that planned to receive fire and keep going. It was unmistakably a warship hull, a very large one, and it had been out here in this star system, drifting cold and silent. Long enough for the outer plating to accumulate the kind of micrometeorite scoring and radiation erosion patterns that represents centuries rather than years. Perry 7 Class Amber, I asked. Survey match probability 94.3%, Voiceless said. Hull metallurgical signature is consistent with the construction signatures we have on file from the survey data. Age degradation pattern on the outer plating is consistent with approximately 3,000 years of deep space drift. A pause. It may have been in this system the entire time, or it may have drifted here from another system over the centuries. There is no way to determine which from here. So it is one of theirs, I said, a derelict. All indicators say dormant, potentially derelict. He was careful with the word. Voiceless was thorough. I had always appreciated that about him. In 14 months of shared posting, I had come to rely on his precision with language, the way he distinguished between what the instrument said and what could be inferred from what the instrument said. No power readings consistent with active systems. No heat signature beyond what you would expect from a cold hull sitting in space for 3 millennia. No response on any frequency across 17 contact attempts in the last 11 minutes. I ran the initial count automatically because that is what you do. I opened my doctrine table and I looked for the entry for dormant warship hull, per contact civilization, no active threat indicators, and I found it. Standard salvage protocols, no combat rating required. Retrieval team dispatch recommended if the hull has structural integrity above 40%. Survival ratio entry. NA, no engagement anticipated. I logged the contact as dormant salvage candidate and marked it for the retrieval team queue. That was my first error. I want to be precise about the sequence of the next events because the timing is relevant to understanding what happened, and the timing is something I have reconstructed very carefully from the data I was able to preserve. I have run the reconstruction 6 times. The numbers are consistent. At 8:47 hours, ship time, the contact at bearing 17, Mark 22 registered a power spike on the thermal sensors. At 8:47 hours and 12 seconds, the power spike resolved into a sustained reading, hull core temperature rising from near background to an initial measurement of approximately 400 standard thermal units, then continuing to climb in a steady, deliberate curve that was nothing like the erratic thermal signature you see on a hull with damaged or degraded power systems. It was smooth, controlled, the curve of a system coming online in the precise sequence its designers had intended. At 8:47 hours and 31 seconds, Voiceless said, "Counter, the contact is powering on." At 8:47 hours and 44 seconds, the contact registered on the active electromagnetic spectrum for the first time. Multiple emission bands simultaneously, not one system coming online and then another, but all of them together, as though the entire vessel had a single master switch and someone had just thrown it. Propulsion signature, main drives, not maneuvering thrusters. Weapons systems, cycling through what appeared to be a full activation sequence, each array confirming readiness in parallel rather than in series. Communications arrays, transmitting on 17 distinct frequencies in parallel, including 3 that I did not immediately recognize, and that Voiceless could not cross-reference against any active civilization communications standard in our database. At 8:47 hours and 55 seconds, I opened the doctrine table entry for reactivated dormant warship hull, pre-contact civilization. The field was blank. I stared at that blank field for what felt like a very long time but was probably 4 seconds. In 4 seconds you can think several things, I thought. The table update is overdue, this should have been flagged by the maintenance review. I thought, the closest entry will be adequate. I thought, this is a 3,000-year-old hull running on power cells that have been sitting dormant for 30 centuries. Whatever it can do, it cannot do much. I thought all of these things in approximately 4 seconds, and then I flagged the contact status as active unknown, and sent an alert up the chain to First Director Rethaal. At 8:48 hours and 8 seconds, First Director Rethaal's voice came over the command channel. He sounded composed. He was always composed. He said, "I see the contact. What is the doctrine classification?" "Sir," I said, "the doctrine table does not have an entry for this contact configuration." There was a pause, brief, perhaps 3 seconds, then, "Run a full cross-reference. Find the closest matching entry." I ran the cross-reference. The closest matching entry was ancient hull reactivation, which is a theoretical category in the table representing civilizations that had achieved warship technology before going dormant and whose hulls had been found to be partially functional upon contact. There were 9 entries in this category across succession history, all of them in the low-threat range. The highest rated of those 9 had a survival ratio of 91.7. The entry noted that ancient hulls typically have degraded weapon systems, compromised structural integrity, and limited propulsion capability owing to power cell decay over extended dormancy periods. The conclusion was simple and it was consistent across all 9 entries. Ancient hulls are dangerous in the way that a corroded bridge is dangerous, in theory capable of harm, but structurally compromised in ways that limit that harm to the short term. Apply force. The hull fails. I reported all of this to First Director Rethaal. The 91.7 figure, the note about degraded systems, the 9 historical precedents. He said, "Standard intercept formation. Deploy leading edge of first wave 400 vessels. Maximum hail attempts on all frequencies. If no response and contact continues to approach, full engagement authorization." It was the correct call. It was exactly what the doctrine said to do. I want to be clear about that. First Director Rethaal followed the doctrine correctly. The doctrine simply had nothing useful to say about what we were facing. At 8:48 hours and 41 seconds, 400 succession vessels peeled from the main formation and moved to intercept bearing. At 8:48 hours and 52 seconds, the IKS Voiceless Covenant. I did not know that name yet. I learned it later. From the hull registry code, we finally managed to decode from one of the 17 transmission frequencies, which turned out to be a looping automated broadcast of the ship's identity, mission parameters, and point of origin, sent in a language that the Succession's linguistics archive had to pull from deep history files to even begin to parse, fired for the first time. I need to stop and tell you what I saw, because seeing it and then writing a doctrine table entry for it are 2 very different things, and I tried to do both simultaneously and could only manage one. What I saw was this: the IKS Voiceless Covenant, which had been drifting cold and silent for approximately 3,000 years through a corridor of stars that had watched its civilization rise and fall and vanish from all communication records, turned toward the 400 succession vessels moving to intercept it, and fired. Not a ranging shot, not a warning discharge, not the exploratory probe of a system testing its systems for the first time in millennia. A full weapons sequence from every emplacement on its port flank simultaneously, coordinated to a precision that Voiceless later told me he had never seen in any active contact civilization in his 16 years of field experience. The beam weapons fired in overlapping arcs designed to maximize coverage area. The kinetic strike arrays fired in a pattern calculated, and I use that word deliberately. It was calculated, not random, not panicked, not opportunistic, to cover the maximum number of distinct vessels in a single sequence, accounting for their formation spacing and their likely evasive dispersal paths. The electromagnetic burst weapons fired on frequencies we later determined were specifically matched to the resonance frequencies of Rethaal hull shielding. It knew what we were. It knew how our shields worked. It had run an analysis of our formation and our hull signatures in the time it took to power on, and it had built an intercept solution that accounted for our specific technology profile. In the 11 seconds of that first weapons sequence, 47 of the 400 intercept vessels were destroyed. Not disabled, not damaged. Destroyed, hull integrity 0, no recoverable signals, no debris larger than approximately 4 meters across. The efficiency of it was the first number that did not fit any column in any table I had ever been trained to read. 47 vessels in 11 seconds, from a hull that had been drifting cold in deep space for 3,000 years. 47. First Director Rethaal ordered full engagement. All 4,700 vessels, minus the 47, moved to combat formation. Here is what I need you to understand about what happened next, because I have gone over the data many times and I want to be accurate. The Rethaal Succession's fleet did not fail. Our weapons worked. Our shields worked at their rated performance. Our commanders made sound tactical decisions under conditions of extreme stress and uncertainty. The 9th Enumeration Corps executed the engagement doctrine with professional precision. There was no breakdown in command, no panic among the crews sufficient to degrade performance, no equipment failure that could explain the outcome. We were a functioning military force doing what we had been trained to do. The outcome was not caused by any inadequacy in us. The outcome was caused by what the IKS Voiceless Covenant was. It was 11 kilometers long and 1.8 kilometers at the beam. It had been built, as best we were later able to determine from the partial translation of its identity broadcast, in the 43rd year of what its civilization had called the last preparation, a period of concentrated, urgent warship construction that the Perry 7 class Amber survey had noted in its records as an unprecedented mobilization spike. We do not know what they were preparing against. The external threat that drove the last preparation is not in any archive we have ever accessed, and the IKS Voiceless Covenant's mission statement, as we decoded it, spoke of an obligation without naming an enemy, which I have thought about many times since, because it suggests that by the time they built the ship, the enemy may have been understood well enough that naming it in the mission statement seemed redundant. You do not explain rain to someone who has been living in it. Whatever the threat was, they built against it with a seriousness that I have not seen in any civilization the succession has processed. The IKS Voiceless Covenant had armor at the bow and dorsal ridge that was 9 meters thick, 9 meters of layered composite alloy with a material structure that Voiceless instruments could not fully characterize, because the outer layer scattered our analysis beams in ways that suggested a material composition we did not have in our metallurgical database. Our standard breach penetration weapons, which are rated to defeat hull armor up to 4.3 meters of standard succession specification alloy equivalent, made no penetrating impact on it at ranges under 300 kilometers. They hit. The impact registrations were unambiguous on our instruments. The energy transfer was real. The IKS Voiceless Covenant's armor did not care. It did not even register a temperature increase consistent with our weapons-rated output. The energy was absorbed and dispersed through the composite lattice in a way our instruments could detect as a diffuse thermal haze across the hull surface, but could not concentrate into any structurally significant effect. It absorbed the energy and continued accelerating. It was moving at full speed, and its full speed, once the main drives were engaged, turned out to be significantly higher than our doctrine model for ancient hulls predicted. Our model said ancient drives, power cell decay, degraded propulsion, maximum effective velocity perhaps 60% of current succession standards. The IKS Voiceless Covenant passed through 60% of current succession standards in approximately the first 90 seconds and kept going. It continued to accelerate for another 40 seconds beyond that point, reaching a final cruising velocity that I measured at 1.14 times the maximum velocity of our fastest vessel class. A hull 11 kilometers long, massing in the range of 12 million standard tons, moving faster than our quickest ships. That is not a typographic error. I have checked it 6 times in the data logs. At 8:51 hours, 3 minutes and 8 seconds after the initial weapons discharge, the IKS Voiceless Covenant had transited the outer edge of our formation and was in the center of the fleet. I need you to understand what that means tactically. When a single hostile contact transits to the geometric center of a fleet formation of 4,700 vessels, the fleet can no longer bring its full firepower to bear on the contact without risking fire on its own ships. The formation discipline that concentrates firepower also becomes the mechanism by which the contact shields itself from that firepower, because we cannot fire through our own vessels. The IKS Voiceless Covenant, moving at 1.14 times our maximum velocity, had put itself in the one position where 4,700 Rethaal warships could not collectively kill it without killing each other. Every formation the doctrine prescribed for high-threat contacts assumed the threat would remain at engagement range. No formation in the table accounted for a contact fast enough to reach the formation center before the formation could respond. It then proceeded to fire in every direction simultaneously. I was counting, I have to tell you that. I was at my station, on the tender threshold of accounts, which was positioned at the fleet's rearmost edge because tenders are not warships and the doctrine places them at distance during engagements, and I was watching the count go down, and I was entering figures into my log, and I was, at some point during the second minute of that engagement, aware, fully, consciously, not as an abstraction, but as a concrete understanding that settled into me like cold water, that the numbers I was logging were not numbers any counter had ever logged before. There is no doctrine entry for it. But I was counting because it is what I know how to do, and because counting was the only way I could remain myself in that moment. The numbers were the rope I was holding. At 8:51 hours and 22 seconds, 4,653 vessels remaining. At 8:52 hours and 14 seconds, 4,581 vessels remaining. At 8:53 hours and 40 seconds, 4,479 vessels remaining. At 8:54 hours and 12 seconds, 4,303 vessels remaining. The IKS Voiceless Covenant was firing in a rotating sequence, port weapons, then starboard, then bow, then aft, cycling through what appeared to be a programmed engagement pattern rather than a reactive one. It was not prioritizing concentrations of return fire. It was not targeting our heaviest weapons platforms first. It was not attempting to destroy our command vessels to disrupt our coordination. It was not doing any of the things that active service military doctrine would indicate as high-value targeting priorities. It was working through the fleet in a systematic arc, as though completing a task it had assigned itself before the engagement began, and was now executing without modification. That was the most frightening thing, not the weapons, not the speed, not the armor that absorbed our fire without registering damage, the fact that it was not reacting to us. We were not a threat it needed to respond to. We were a task it was completing. We were a number it was reducing. We were an entry in a column. At 8:55 hours and 7 seconds, First Director Rethaal ordered dispersal, break formation, scatter on individual headings, reduce target density. This was correct doctrine. In theory, a scattering fleet is harder to efficiently engage because the engagement solution must be recalculated for each vessel individually rather than applied to a dense formation. Dispersal reduces the geometric efficiency of area effect weapons and forces any attacker to prosecute individual targets. The IKS Voiceless Covenant continued its rotation pattern without modification. I do not believe it needed to recalculate. I believe it had already calculated. Every vessel's position, velocity, probable dispersal vector. It had the data from the moment it powered on, and it had processed the data in the seconds between power on and first fire, and the solution it was executing was already a solution for the dispersal, not for the formation. We had scattered into the answer it had already prepared. At 8:56 hours and 41 seconds, the threshold of accounts registered weapons fire against our hull for the first time. First Director Rethaal's voice on the command channel, utterly composed. All hands brace. The tender shook, A hard lateral jolt, the kind that knocks loose anything that isn't properly secured. The lights flickered and held. My water container fell from the edge of my station, and I caught it without thinking, an automatic gesture, and then sat holding it for a moment, looking at it. Because the mundanity of it seemed briefly impossible, the secondary hull integrity report came up on my screen, minor scoring on the port dorsal plating. Minor. We were not the target, we were in the arc. Voiceless, sitting 2 meters from me, was looking at his instruments with an expression I had never seen on him before. Voiceless was 41 cycles old and had served on 8 expansion campaigns, and had the professional flatness of someone who had made peace with occupational danger the way you make peace with weather. You note it, you prepare for it. You accept it as outside your control. The expression on his face was not that. It was something older than professionalism. It was the expression of a man whose categories have failed him, and who does not yet have new ones. A man looking at something that fits nothing he was given to understand the world with. "Counter," he said quietly, not looking at me. "What is the survival ratio for this contact?" I did not answer him. I was looking at the hull registry decode that had finally come back from the linguistics archive. It was partial, only about 30% resolved, the linguists told me, because the language in the broadcast was 3,000 years old, and the archive's database for this civilization had been compiled from fragmentary survey data and was not complete. But 30% was enough. The ship's name resolved cleanly because names tend to be more stable across linguistic drift than operational vocabulary. IKS Voiceless Covenant. The letters were a transliteration of the original designation's phoneme structure, and the meaning in the original language, the linguists noted, was something close to keeper of the compact that does not speak. They suggested the phrase compact might refer to a treaty or a commitment or a promise held between parties, with that does not speak indicating it was an unannounced or silently kept obligation rather than a publicly declared one. A promise not proclaimed. A vow held without witness. The mission statement was mostly intact. The linguists had worked quickly. Under pressure they could feel through the urgency of my request flag, and they had done their best with the fragments they had. It read, "This vessel CARRIES the final authorization of the ironkeep assembly, issued in the 43rd year of the last preparation. It is built to last longer than those who built it. It is built to remember what those who built it knew. If those who built it are gone, it continues. It continues until the task is complete. It does not stop because we are gone." There was more below that, but the linguists had not resolved it. The fragment that followed, the part they could not translate, was longer than the part they could. Whatever else the Ironkeep Assembly had written into the mission statement of the IKS Voiceless Covenant, it was extensive. Whatever they had wanted this ship to carry into the future on their behalf, they had written it in full. They had not abbreviated. They had not assumed the future would understand. They had written it all down, carefully, completely, as though they knew there would be no one left to explain it in person. I read those words 3 times. It does not stop because we are gone. I was a 22-cycle-old counter whose highest survival ratio memorization had been the floor of 61.4. I had grown up in the certainty that the succession's math always worked. 412 years, 931 civilizations. The math always worked because we had always been on the side of the math. We had always been the overwhelming number. We had always been the civilization with more ships than our opponents could destroy. We had always been the reason that the civilizations we encountered looked at the doctrine tables and found their survival ratio and accepted the inevitable calculus. It had never occurred to me that someone had built a ship to be the number that did not run out. At 8:57 hours and 11 seconds, First Director Rethaal command channel went silent. I do not know what happened to him. His vessel was not one I was tracking individually at that moment. I was tracking the aggregate count, as doctrine required. The aggregate count at 8:57 hours and 11 seconds was 4,044 vessels remaining. No one issued further orders. The Ninth Enumeration Corps' surviving vessels continued dispersal. Some of them were attempting to exit the corridor entirely. I could see the drive vectors on the formation display, vessels peeling away on outbound headings, pushing their drives to maximum output. The IKS Voiceless Covenant did not pursue. It did not accelerate toward any individual fleeing vessel. It did not appear to have a targeting priority system that classified retreating contacts as high-value chase targets. It was completing its arc. I was counting. At 8:58 hours, 3,991 vessels remaining. At 8:58 hours and 30 seconds, 3,847 vessels remaining. At 8:59 hours, 3,702 vessels remaining. The threshold of accounts was hit 2 more times in this period, both minor, both on the port dorsal quarter. I logged the damage reports automatically, my hands moving through the documentation sequence while my eyes stayed on the aggregate count. Minor, minor. We were not the target. The tender was in the arc and the arc was sweeping through, but the IKS Voiceless Covenant was killing warships. It knew what we were. It knew we were not a warship. At 900 hours, 3,511 vessels remaining. At 9:01 hours, 3,204 vessels remaining. At 9:02 hours, 2,889 vessels remaining. The IKS Voiceless Covenant's weapons fire rate slowed slightly between 9:02 and 9:04 hours, dropping by approximately 18%. Voiceless noticed it. He had never stopped watching his instruments. He said, without inflection, "The way you state a fact that has no emotional valence, you know how to apply to it. Power management cycle. It is managing heat dissipation in the weapons arrays." He looked at his screen for a moment. "It is packing itself," he said. It was packing itself. It had been firing continuously for 15 minutes. It was managing its power cycle to ensure sustainable long-term output, not expending everything at once, not pushing the weapons arrays past their thermal limits, not trading long-term function for short-term intensity. The way a careful, methodical being does a difficult job that has to be done completely, not with fury, not with the expenditure of everything at once and the hope that it is enough. With the patience of a thing that knows it has time, that has always had time, that was designed with patience woven into its operating parameters. At 9:03 hours and 40 seconds, the IKS Voiceless Covenant completed what I came to understand, in retrospect, was the first full rotation of its weapons arc. It had passed through the fleet geometrically, starting at bearing 17 Mark 22, rotating through the formation in a consistent clockwise sweep from its reference frame, completing a full 360-degree engagement pass, and arriving back at its starting heading. Rethaal vessels remaining at the completion of that first sweep, 2,677. It began a second arc. I want to be very clear about what this means, because it was the moment I stopped being a counter in the functional sense and became something I do not have a precise word for in any vocabulary I have been taught. A witness, a recorder, the last person at the instruments, still counting because counting is the only thing I know how to do when everything else has stopped making sense. The Ninth Enumeration Corps had deployed with 4,700 vessels. In the first sweep, 15 minutes of continuous weapons fire from a hull that had been drifting cold in deep space for 3,000 years, we had lost approximately 43% of our fleet. The IKS Voiceless Covenant had not been scratched, not meaningfully. Its hull temperature had risen across the engagement profile, but purely from the reflected energy of its own weapons cycling. Our fire had contributed nothing to that temperature curve. Our fire had done nothing. It began a second arc. At 9:06 hours, 2,511 vessels remaining. At 9:07 hours, 2,314 vessels remaining. At 9:08 hours, 2,103 vessels remaining. At 9:09 hours, 1,897 vessels remaining. I have thought since then about the crews of those vessels, the 1.2 million Rethaal lives I had logged on the departure manifest. I knew the count, but I did not know the people. I was a counter, not a personnel officer, and the names behind the numbers had never been my domain. I think about them now. I think about whether they understood what was happening, whether the doctrine training gave them a framework for it, or whether they were, in the end, in the same position I was, watching something that had no entry in any table they had ever been given. I think they were. I think the entire 9th Enumeration Corps spent those 19 minutes in the same condition I was in, technically functional, executing protocol, maintaining discipline, and completely without any framework adequate to understand what we were being done to. That is not a condemnation of anyone. It is the honest description of what happens when a category error confronts a civilization that has never encountered its own blank fields before. At 9:10 hours, 1,644 vessels remaining. At 9:11 hours, 1,399 vessels remaining. At 9:12 hours, 1,147 vessels remaining. At 9:13 hours, 893 vessels remaining. At 9:14 hours, 617 vessels remaining. At 9:15 hours, 344 vessels remaining. At 9:16 hours, 81 vessels remaining. At 9:16 hours and 42 seconds, the weapon's fire stopped. I looked up from my instruments. It was involuntary. The absence of something is often more arresting than its presence, and the absence of the continuous distant percussion of engagement was so sudden and complete that it pulled my eyes up before I had consciously decided to move them. Voiceless was looking at his instruments, hands flat on the station edge, very still. The tender deck was quiet in a way it had not been for 29 minutes. The ventilation hum, which I had stopped hearing in the first minute of the engagement, was audible again. Someone behind me in the deck bay was breathing loudly. The IKS Voiceless Covenant was at bearing 9 Mark 14, approximately 14,000 kilometers from our position. Its weapons arrays were cycling through what appeared to be a post-engagement cooldown sequence, a thermal management routine, systematically drawing down the residual heat in the firing systems. Its main drives were still active, but it was not moving. It was holding position. 81 vessels, out of 4,781. I entered the number in my log, 81, the highest loss engagement in succession history. I knew this immediately, without having to check, because I had memorized the tables, had been 61.4% losses for the VEC confluence. We had lost 98.3%. The confluence figure had been sufficient to earn the engagement a doctrine entry that remained in the table as a warning, as the outer limit of what a civilization could do to us. The field for the IKS Voiceless Covenant was still blank. I did not know what to put in it. There is no field designed for a number below 0, and in a sense, a survival ratio of 1.7% is below 0, because the doctrine table does not go that low. It bottoms out at some theoretical minimum that the table designers had set as a floor below which they had decided, on the evidence of 412 years of expansion, it was not necessary to plan. They had set the floor with complete confidence, and the floor was fine, and the floor was correct, and it had held for 412 years, and the IKS Voiceless Covenant had come up from the deep of 3,000 years of silence and gone straight through it. Voiceless spoke first. He said very quietly, "What do we log it as?" I did not answer him immediately. I was thinking about the ironkeep assembly. I had read 11 pages on Perry 7 class Amber 3 days ago, and I had noted the mobilization spike, and I had thought it was the file of a civilization that had panicked and then died. I had read the words unprecedented mobilization, and I had translated them, in my mind, into the language of the doctrine table. high military development index, probable internal conflict, eventual collapse. I had not translated them into what they actually were. They were not panicking, they were preparing. They were building against something with the specific understanding that they might not survive to see the outcome, that the war they were preparing for might outlast them, might outlast their children, might outlast everyone who remembered why it was being fought, and they were building accordingly. They were building not a weapon that would win the war for them, but a weapon that would keep fighting the war after them. They were translating their knowledge and their conviction and their understanding of the threat into a form that did not require them to survive. The IKS Voiceless Covenant was not a warship. It was a message. It was what you say when you know you will not be alive to say it yourself. I knew what was coming. I prepared. The preparation continues. Whatever finds this corridor after I am gone will find that I was here, and that I did not accept the outcome, and that I built something to carry that refusal forward. A compact held in silence. I do not have a word for the Ironkeep Assembly's level of seriousness. In Rethaal, the word we use for the quality that drives a civilization to build its scale, to project force, to expand and absorb and process, is something that translates approximately as righteous momentum. The sense of being on the correct side of the math, the inevitability of your own direction. The succession has righteous momentum. We always have. 931 civilizations, and the math always works. And the math is right because it has always been right. And it has always been right because we are the ones who define what right looks like. The Ironkeep Assembly had a different quality. I do not think Rethaal has a word for it. It is not momentum. Momentum implies ongoing forward movement. What they had was more like gravity, not moving, but pulling everything toward a point from which it would not release, even after the source was gone. The point persisted. The pull persisted. At 9:17 hours and 12 seconds, the IKS Voiceless Covenant resumed forward movement, not toward the remaining 81 succession vessels, not in pursuit of the dispersing fleet. It had a heading. It had, I think, always had a heading. The engagement with us had been an interruption to the heading, not the destination. The Ironkeep Assembly had built this ship to go somewhere and do something, and we had been in the corridor, and it had processed us the way it had been built to process military contacts in this corridor, and now the interruption was complete, and it was going back to what it had been doing. The heading, as best Voiceless could determine from its drive vector, was inward deeper along the corridor, toward the galactic core end of Reach Corridor 7, along a bearing that did not intersect any succession installation we were aware of, and that passed, if extrapolated forward at current heading, through several systems we had not yet processed in this expansion cycle. Voiceless ran the extrapolation quietly and then sat looking at it without saying anything for a moment. "Counter," he said finally, "the heading takes it through Reach Corridor 8. Reach Corridor 8 was the next expansion zone after 7, 18 systems. Active succession administrative presence in 4 of them, colonial outposts, resource extraction stations, a small garrison base at the far end. Approximately 340,000 Rethaal lives in the corridor. I entered a priority absolute dispatch at 9:18 hours. Priority absolute is the highest classification in the succession's transmission system, and I had never used it before in my career. I included the count: 4,619 vessels destroyed, 81 remaining. I included the translation fragment. I included the heading vector and Voiceless' extrapolation. I included everything I had: the doctrine table's blank field, the age of the hull, the weapon specifications as best we had measured them, the armor analysis, the velocity measurements. I sent it on all long-range channels simultaneously, and I did not wait for confirmation of receipt. I do not know if Succession Command will know what to do with the dispatch. I do not know if they have a protocol for a blank doctrine field of this kind. I do not know if the framework they have built, 412 years, 931 civilizations. The math always works, has room for the category I am now trying to describe. I know what the category is. I have been thinking about it since 9:17 hours, watching the IKS Voiceless Covenant's drive signature on my instruments as it recedes, and I have found the simplest way I can state it. There are civilizations that win their wars while alive, and there are civilizations that build to win their wars after they are gone. The succession has never encountered the second kind. The succession's doctrine does not have an entry for the second kind, because the second kind requires a level of certainty, a conviction so deep that it can be cast in metal and launched into the dark, and trusted to hold its shape for 3,000 years without revision, without reinforcement, without any living hand to guide it, that we have not, in 412 years and 931 civilizations, ever encountered. We encounter it now. The ironkeep assembly is gone. Their civilization is gone. The corridor they built in and fought over and mobilized desperately and finally went silent in is a collection of cold planets and empty orbits and one shipyard we passed 3 days ago with its berths long empty, its hull eaten by time, its purpose forgotten. Everything they made is gone. Except one thing. One thing they made is still here. One thing they built to last longer than them is still here, moving at 1.14 times the maximum velocity of our fastest vessel, carrying an obligation they wrote in full and launched into the dark and trusted to keep, and it has kept it, and it is keeping it still, and wherever it is going, it will arrive. At 9:19 hours, the IKS Voiceless Covenant's drive signature was still clearly visible on our instruments at a range of approximately 47,000 kilometers. At 9:22 hours, at 84,000 kilometers, it was still visible. At 9:25 hours, at 131,000 kilometers, still visible. The drive output steady and clean and without variation. The output of a propulsion system that had just run the longest engagement in its operational history and showed no sign of strain, no sign of degradation, no sign that it had done anything in the last 19 minutes that warranted any adjustment to its ongoing function. I am still watching it. The 81 remaining vessels of the 9th Enumeration Corps are assembling at a rally point 3 light minutes from this position. I have logged the count. I will log the final count when the assembly is complete. I am still a counter. I am still doing my job. The job has not changed even though everything else has. What has changed is that I understand something the doctrine table does not contain and may never contain, that the most durable force in the galaxy is not the one with the most ships, or the fastest ships, or the heaviest weapons, or the deepest reserves. It is the one that decided before it built anything what it would never stop doing. It is the one that built its conviction into the hull instead of its crew. Its crew can die. Its crew did die. 3,000 years ago, the last member of the Ironkeep Assembly's military service died somewhere in this corridor or somewhere adjacent to it, and the IKS Voiceless Covenant drifted on alone, and it was not diminished by the loss of the people who built it, because it had been built to be undiminished by their loss. You cannot outlast something like that. You can only be in its path or not be in its path. We were in its path. I am still watching it on the instruments. The drive signature is at 180,000 kilometers now and still resolving clearly. Still,